In this video, we'll discover the Context API, which offers us an amazing way to share globally available data with child components without the need for implementing props. Once we understand this concept, we'll refactor the application we saw in the previous video and use the createContext function to create a context, after which we'll create provider and consumer components to supply and consume global data. So let's begin. We discussed the issue of prop drilling in the last video. We saw how implementing React's top-down data flow architecture using props can often lead us to a situation where you have several forwarding props that simply carry data for deeply nested components. Such props must be built across all intermediary components in the hierarchy. As the application evolves and more features and components are added, these forwarding props would only increase, leading to logistical and debugging nightmares. What is needed is a way to share global data with any number of child components without the need to explicitly pass the data through props. React offers us a plethora of options ranging from better composition strategies to using render props, better abstraction of components, and even global state management solutions like Redux. One feature which stands out is the Context API. In simple words, it lets you share data with child components without needing any props at all. We first create a context object which allows us to classify a resource and create instances of providers and consumers. Using this context object, we can create provider components that allow child components to subscribe to changes in the context. At the consumer end, we can then create consumer components that implement render props and allow the component to directly fetch and consume data from the context instead of using props. Let's understand the Context API using an example. Begin by downloading and setting up the project from the link given on the screen. As always, I have my development server up and running. Here we have the same app that we saw in the last video. We have here our restaurant card component that accepts data using props and passes it down to the details component, which again forwards to the open or closed and offer components. So let's get rid of these props and implement the Context API. The first thing we'll do is create a context object that acts like a global carrier of data. I'll create a new file in the components folder named restaurantcontext.js. Here, I'll first import the createContext method from the React library. I'll then create a new context object named restaurantContext using the createContext function, and we'll export it out of this file. Depending on the nature of data, you can create multiple contexts. For instance, this context object will help us provide restaurant data to our hierarchy of components. You might want to create another context object that provides data related to the current logged in user. Another context might provide user-centric application preferences. Now back in our little project, in the app.js file, we'll continue to accept data in the restaurant card component using props. The reason is that we still want the restaurant card component to be reusable in the context of this project, and for that, we must accept data using props. Our real problem is how this data is trickled down props inside the restaurant card component. Let's fix that using the Context API. So, in our restaurant card component, I'll begin by importing my context object like so. We then want our children components, namely details and score, to be able to procure data from the context object. For this purpose, we'll have to create a data provider that acts like a bucket from where our child components can directly fetch the data they need. We can do this by creating a component named restaurantcontext.provider. This is known as a context provider component, and its job is to provide data to its child components. But where's the data that we want to provide? To set the source of data for the provider, we'll configure its value property as an object that simply provides access to the data coming in from the parent. With this done, it's time to say goodbye to all these props. Yes, you don't need any of these props now. Now, ignore the errors that you see here. Our app is just a bit angry at the missing data that was coming in through the props. We'll fix this in a moment. With the restaurant card component now set up as a provider, let's focus our attention on the consumers. Let's tackle the score component first. We want our score data here. So first up, let's import our restaurant context object like so. Then I'll replace the current render template here with an instance of the restaurant context dot consumer component. Just as the provider component accepts data and creates a channel, the consumer component subscribes to that channel for fetching data directly inside a component. And this special component implements render props. So we'll bring the score property directly like so, and we'll render our original layout for this component as a child. I'll also change the value here to score to correctly access the data, and we can remove the incoming value prop as well. We would now be able to fetch the score value directly from our provider. This won't get rid of our errors just yet because the details component still needs work. So in the details component, we'll again bring in our context object first. And just like the score component, we'll implement our consumer component like so, and this time we'll bring in the name, categories, and location data from the provider because these are consumed directly by the details component. In the JSX template, we'll render the value of categories instead of category, and this gets our app back up and working. Notice how the score component is correctly rendering the data, fetched now directly from the context provider and not using any props. Even the details component is working fine, fetching name, location, and categories from the provider. What is not working are the open or closed and offer components. Let's fix them. We'll bring in the context instance first, and we'll again wrap our layout inside a consumer component like so. I've also remapped the incoming property is open as status because that's how we are consuming it here in the component. And our status is back online as expected. Last up, let's repeat this process one last time in our offer component. While I am here, I am also going to get rid of the default prop configuration, which was setting the offer text value in the prop to no offers available in a situation where the offer text prop is not set. Since there is no such prop needed, the default props feature isn't needed either. That's it. Our application is now using the context API and works like magic and doesn't require your components to implement deeply nested and forwarding props. As you can see from this example, we were able to refactor our old configuration that relied on props to one that uses the context API where components do not rely on their parents and props and can directly access data from a centrally subscribed resource. If you're using class components, then you can use the context type property as shown here to set the context, after which you can directly access the value of the context anywhere in the class component, including lifecycle methods using this .context.property name. You can set a default value to the provider at the create context level. This value will be used if you're trying to access a value at the consumer and no provider component is present upstream to supply the data. You can additionally implement inverse data flow by first initializing a shape to a function as a default value and then implementing it at the provider level. This function can now be accessed and used in any consumer for sending data back up to the parent. The only thing to keep in mind when using this API is that you're hard coding references to a context in your components, which prevents component reusability. So while the context API is great, you might want to explore better component composition strategies and using patterns like render props or higher order components, especially if your component needs to be shared and reused.